They're saying that relevant messages, particularly related to COVID, would be appropriate, but not every single WhatsApp message they've ever sent. I mean, we send loads of WhatsApp messages every day, and so do government ministers. Would that really be appropriate?
Well, one of the points she's made, it touches on the point that I think I've just made, which is if you're just going to leave it to civil servants in Downing Street, and by the way, there looks as though there's quite a turf war going on about this in any event, then you might not touch on the things that she's interested in, that they might not think is relevant. So, say there are text messages about Shakespeare, they might say, well, that's not relevant to this inquiry. She's already made it plain that if she thinks the Prime Minister was distracted by, as it were, Shakespeare, rather than concentrating on COVID, that's something that is relevant. And I think that's probably for her, since she's running the inquiry, to make that judgment.
Rob Wilson, what do you make of this, that Baroness Hallett wants all the unredacted WhatsApp messages and to make her own decision about what she feels is relevant or not relevant to her inquiry?
Well, I think she can ask for whatever she wants. Right. And as long as it's within her terms of reference, she has every right to get the information she needs. Because at the end of the day, what you want is the truth. You want to know exactly what happened, why it happened, and you need to learn the lessons. And if she can get all the information to do that, then that is absolutely right that it should happen. But there is also a case to be made for if you're just loading the inquiry with lots of irrelevant information that isn't germane to the investigation at all, then why would she want that information? I mean, I guess if she wants to plough through hundreds of thousands of messages and WhatsApps and God knows what, well, that's entirely up to her and her team.
It's going to take years, isn't it? I mean, this is going to cost millions of pounds. I'm hearing someone earlier today told me that it was going to be 2030 before this inquiry would report. Can we wait that long?
I don't think so, because it's really important, as I say, that we learn the lessons of the last few years, because we clearly weren't ready for what came at us, and we need to be prepared for the next one. And I hope this inquiry will help us to do that. But if it doesn't report in 2030, you have people suggesting that we're going to, in the next 10 years, have an even worse epidemic. So it's really important that we get this right.
Luciana and Berger, do you think that Baroness Hallett's got a point here, that she should be the one to decide what's relevant or not?
I do, because just in terms of the responses that we've heard from government and from the Cabinet Office, it seems incredibly fishy, and that's to be polite. There was a big challenge today from the Cabinet Office, as I understand, to say that they couldn't possibly hand over things that were unambiguously irrelevant. But then separately, they confirmed that they didn't have the documents as of Friday.
Someone's got the documents somewhere, presumably. I'm not sure who.
Indeed. And presumably the Prime Minister's pretty busy, so he's not going to have that many WhatsApp messages. He can't be spending all day on WhatsApp. So I do think, in terms of getting to the truth of the matter, I believe that we can trust the Baroness Hallett, to do her job properly, and therefore she should have access to these, particularly in light of the fact that we've had such contrasting and conflicting statements from government at this time, and they should just get on with it, because the longer that this rumbles on, the more it is a distraction, and ultimately what's the point of this inquiry is to get to the bottom of what has been a very difficult and tragic time for hundreds of thousands of people across, if not millions of people across our country.
Do you fear that it's going to take so long that by the time, Rob was saying that we need to learn the lessons from the inquiry and there could be another pandemic coming, we need to be ready, but by the time it comes out, we may have been through another pandemic before we learn the lessons of the last one?
Well, I think it's important that we obviously reflect on this period, and the job is done properly. That's what's most important. We hope that the inquiry is given all the tools that it needs and the resources necessary to expedite it, to ensure that it does report in a timely fashion. What will be most important, we often get interim reports as well, which will serve and provide, some indication to government departments. But what I think is most important at this time, because there's been such obfuscation and such a distraction, and what seems to be something which, at the moment it feels pretty grubby. So I think what's most important at this time is that the inquiry can do its job properly and report fully.
Adam, you work for a think tank, Onward. You're used to trawling through documents and making a very cogent argument. You're an expert at this. Do you have sympathy with where Baroness Hallett's coming from?
Yeah, so currently at Think Tank, my previous job was working as an advisor up in the West Midlands for the Mayor there, Andy Street. And in that role, you're subject to a freedom of information request. I've got some sympathy with an argument that says, well, look, if everything you ever write or talk about or diary you keep or WhatsApp is going to find its way possibly into the public domain, you might be nervous about having candid conversations. But I think this is a different situation. I think it's for two reasons. One, because there isn't a request here to necessarily put it in the public domain, and Baroness Hallett is absolutely right. She should make the decisions about whether things are material or not. But the other is just how important this is, that actually getting to the bottom of what decisions were made when and how we could respond to another pandemic is crucial. So I think we need to overlook what might be a squeamishness about private conversations because of the size of the prize that we're going after here, the learning that we need to do.
Well, Adam, the government is saying that the COVID inquiry shouldn't be entitled to all the messages sent by Boris Johnson in the pandemic, but only the ones relevant to his handling of the response to COVID. And also it says it doesn't have all of the relevant messages anyway, so it can't send them to the inquiry.
I think the decision about relevance has to be the person doing the investigation, not the individual looking at what evidence they're going to share. And if they don't have these diaries, then I'm surprised that they're able to decide what is and isn't relevant. So I think ultimately the thing we need to do is move on from this. It's so frustrating that we've got another day that the media is focused on the legacy of some of the actions of the Boris Johnson government. We need to crack on. There's more to do.
I think there's something extremely odd about all this and what's going on in the Cabinet Office, because I believe Boris put out a statement today saying he's happy to provide any information the inquiry wants, but he wants the Cabinet Office to tell him what information it wants and to direct him to do that, which is, I think, a fair request to make, so that everything's on record and there's an audit trail of what they're asking Boris for. There's also this issue of how lawyers that were acting for Boris ended up passing information to the police without any reference to the person they're supposed to be representing.
Yes,
I mean,
that's a bit odd.
I really don't understand that, and therefore...
Well, they certainly had a legal duty, didn't they, Rob?
Well, you would have thought they had a legal duty to their client.
It does seem rather strange. I mean, Alan Rusbridger, you've got a bit of experience of dealing with sensitive matters. A text has come in here from Nick in Slough saying, how much privacy should Boris Johnson be entitled to when it comes to his diary? Surely everyone is entitled to at least some. Fair point.
I think if you're Prime Minister, your pool of privacy shrinks to a fairly small pool. He's the most important person in the country. He was there at the time of great crisis. I don't think he can expect much privacy, but with a normal person that would be different. I am worried by the legal costs. He's already charged 200,000 odd for the advice of Lord Panic in his battle with the Privileges Committee, and the heart sinks slightly at the thought that he's now going to hire another team of posh lawyers and we're all going to end up forking the bill.
Well, Luciana?
I was going to reflect, obviously, the focus of our conversation has primarily been about the WhatsApp messages, but there's also these 24 notebooks, which are separate.
Also gone missing.
Well, apparently. I mean, and they are separate to his official ministerial diaries, which the Cabinet Office would have access to.
Maybe he was working on his next book.
Well, perhaps he was, and perhaps he was spending too much time working on his next book rather than the job at hand, which, during a pandemic required all of his attention as the leader and Prime Minister of this country in that moment. I do think it's important in order to gather a whole picture, and because at the moment it seems like so much has gone missing, that those should form part of the evidence as well.
Ben, just to go back to you very quickly, just in a couple of sentences, Ben in Clacton, what do you make of what you've heard?
Well, she should have the documents. And there's been so much slushing around on allegations of corruption as well that may have caused the deaths of many thousands of people. We all should be aware of what went on. And that's relevant to all the people that lost relatives for possibly because of the incompetence of the corruption of the government ministers.
Well, indeed. Look, there has to be a proper inquiry. We need to get to the bottom of exactly what happened, who knew what, when, and what actions were taken and what the justification was. Really interesting discussion to get us underway at Cross Question. This is Cross Question on LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj, and we'll be back in a minute with your further questions. If you want to put a question to the panel, please call on 03456060973, text on 84850, and tweet at LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj on LBC. It's 8:15.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question. Tweet at LBC.
You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. I'm Ali Miraj, and I'm joined by Luciana Berger, former Labour MP, Rob Wilson, former Conservative MP and Minister, Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect, and Adam Hawksbee, Deputy Director of the think tank Onward. Get your questions in. You can ask them about anything that's on your mind, 03456060973, text on 84850, and tweet at LBC. Now, Will Crediton has got a text question come in. Today, as does Chairman Lord Stuart Rose, warned of unintended consequences if price caps were introduced on basic products. Do the panel believe he's right or think this is just scaremongering? Would the panel also agree that we need minimum quotas on the price supermarkets pay for produce to support struggling farmers like me? Luciana Berger, I wanted to come to you first because I just realised when I was looking up before we met this evening that you went to the same school as me. And I never, you're obviously a lot younger than I am, but I never did see you at the girls' school gate, where I spent quite a lot of time. So
too busy studying.
Favouritism.
What do you make of this?
Well, I think that it's, we're in very, very difficult times. And I'm only sorry that we're talking about this as a second item rather than the first item in our conversation, and that the former Prime Minister has diverted us away from talking about this. We are seeing extraordinary levels of food price inflation, just over 19%. If we just look at food and drink alone, the average pint of a price of milk up by 33% over the course of the past year, having a massive detrimental impact on thousands and thousands of families around our country. So absolutely right that we're talking about it. I think it's incumbent on the government of the day to be taking responsibility to contend with this very serious issue. This is not a surprise. This is not something that's crept up. This is something that has been very much part and parcel of our national conversation, and the facts have spoken for themselves. Inflation continuing to rise, and in part also specifically because within food production, because of the cost of energy.
Yes, of course.
And as a former shadow energy minister that sat through hours and hours and hours of energy bills back in 2011 and 2012 and 2013, I'm not surprised we're in this situation today, but it was incumbent on a government that took no action when it came to creating energy supply in this country, which means we're having to contend with that issue today. When it comes to your specific question about what the supermarkets are saying, I don't think price controls help. I do think there's lots more that can and should be done. I think it's lazy.
Yep.
I think the government should be taking a lot more action, more interventionist approach, which it could and should have been doing for years. The fact that we're having to contend with this answer now because it's so serious. And I just saw as I came to the studio this evening that particularly cheese and meat costs look set to increase even further and escalate even higher. So the government is in a bit of a situation, but it's the government's responsibility, and I think this is a lazy way out.
But what do you say to Stuart Rose, the chairman of ASDA, who said that you can't interfere in markets? He's got a point, hasn't he?
I don't think this is the right course of action. I think there's lots of things that could and should have been done. I should have added one of the specific challenges, which means that our prices are likely to increase higher, is because of post-Brexit controls that are due to be introduced this autumn, which the government hasn't addressed either. So it's a myriad of different issues, which, again, it's no surprise. These issues have been raised with the government for over the past decades, and not just Brexit's only going to exacerbate it, but this has not been a surprise. Obviously, additional shocks have added to it, but this is not something that's just crept up on the government of the day. And so I don't think it's the right approach. I think something needs to be done, and there's many things that can and should be done, but I don't think price controls are the way to go about it.
Thanks for bringing up the B word, Luciana. I was wondering how long it would take for us to get to that one. Adam, what do you think?
I think this is an absolutely classic. Government tries to float a story in the Sunday papers to see how it will go down, and it went down very poorly. And I think there's a reason it did, because, as Luciana says, the problem is the right one to tackle. The solution is completely wrong. It's a blunt instrument that would not deal with the underlying problem. I think inflation, overall in the economy is a big part of it. There are a range of different things you could try and do. More targeted support. So for those people that are hit most by that inflation and the impact on cost of living, you could uplift universal credit with all the money that you would otherwise spend. You could tackle some of the reasons that food prices might be as high as they are. How could you support mechanisation in agriculture and improve productivity there, so it's less reliant on foreign labour? In France, they've now got co-ops that are producing a massive amount of their milk, which has brought down the price because there's less of a profit margin. Encouraging any of these different models is probably a better thing to do than the blunt tool of setting a price.
Well, it's interesting because the government's talked about controlling inflation. It's one of the Rishi Sunak's 5 KPIs, as you would expect from a foreign investment banker, to come up with key performance indicators. But he's very little he can do to actually solve that problem other than address things like this. But actually tackling inflation is not his job. It's the job of the Bank of England.
Yeah, hugely difficult. And I think when he set that target of halving inflation, a lot of people said, well, that's going to happen anyway without your intervention. I think that's looking more dicey now.
Although it's 8.7%, it's come down a bit. So who knows what could happen by the end of the year. Alan Rusbridger.
I agree with Adam. This sounds like a half, if I can mix my metaphors, a half-baked balloon that was flown in the Sunday papers. And to mix my metaphors even further, it hasn't got legs. I'm slightly sympathetic to half the questioner's proposal. I mean, I think putting a floor on the quotas for farmers, I think makes more sense than trying to control the prices. I mean, the supermarket world is supposed to be one of the most ruthless markets and efficient markets anywhere, and I think we just have to leave it to the markets to sort it out, and I suspect they will.
I'm quite surprised, Alan, because I was thinking, I'm very surprised that there hasn't been much support from what I would have thought would be the left for this proposal. In fact, they were saying it's like Ted Heath-style price controls, which I thought was quite interesting. Do you find that interesting?
Well, I think it is, but I think it's related to this particular market, and I think it is a ruthless and a highly competitive market, and I can't see what governments can do quickly enough and flexibly enough that the market itself can't do.
Rob?
Well, I haven't heard this directly from Rishi Sunak himself, so I'm assuming...
You've got a direct line into government.
Well, I haven't heard it from him directly, so I'm not sure I'm convinced that this is a serious proposal.
A kite's being flown, is it?
A kite's being flown.
Right.
And I'm not sure price caps have ever worked particularly well in a competitive sector, at least. Generally, price caps lead to all sorts of, as Stuart Rose has suggested, unintended consequences. A supermarket, for example, might put up prices elsewhere to cover for the price reductions they're making elsewhere. It may cause shortages, as it did in a number of the Eastern Bloc countries when they tried it. And there's lots of waste and lots of market distortions that result. So I can see why any government would think about it or want to help, because many families are struggling, many families are going through very difficult times. But the supermarkets are extremely competitive. So we have in this country one of the most competitive supermarket operations in the world, I would say, outside of America. So there are better ways in which I think the government can help those struggling families. And I also think that farmers do deserve a better deal. They have struggled for many years, and I think we need, particularly with our need for food security, need to make sure farmers are able to produce food and sell it for profit and make some money, so that we can actually increase the amount of farming that goes on in this country.
Well, it's very interesting that you're all talking about the fact that this is it's a competitive market. Normally, when you have price controls or regulation, it's when you've got a monopolistic type of situation. So I must say, it was quite interesting. Luciana, do you think that the government, if it is kite flying, and they haven't really come out and said that this is a firm policy, they were trying to encourage and the things were being discussed. I mean, do you think it's just a complete waste of time?
A complete waste of time that they floated the idea?
Yes, they floated this idea because, I mean, they're meant to be capitalist Tories in the first place, and they're trying to interfere in markets.
Well, I mean, I don't know how to explain Rishi Sunak's behaviour or his comms team, or why they might have put this, I mean, I think I agree with Adam that it's to see what the response was from what they would have expected to be their supportive quarters, which has not been forthcoming and has not been welcoming of this suggestion. And it's, I listened carefully to the Prime Minister. He wasn't very clear in some of the poll clips that he did earlier today on a specific issue. So we wait and see. But again, it's tackling inflation is one of his KPIs, as you've rightly indicated.
Absolutely. Well, let's go to our next question from Laura in Battersea. Good evening, Laura.
Good evening, everyone. My question is, with security firm Serco being fined $2.25 million on Friday after custody officer was killed in a cell area of a court, should a company in that situation with a criminal conviction still be entitled to government contracts?
Adam.
I think that you should be able to take things like that into consideration in assigning a contract. Any process in which you looked at a large company providing those sorts of services, I'm presuming Home Office, Ministry of Justice, you take those things into consideration. I would probably say that many of the organisations that have taken on contracts of that size and scale of complexity will have similar things on their records, and so it'll be up to the department to weigh it up. So yes, you should be able to take it into account, but I imagine these are enormously difficult circumstances, and on occasions when you're delivering at a massive scale, things like this will occur.
To provide a bit more context to listeners, Serco has been fined $2.25 million over the death of Lorraine Barwell when she was attacked by a prisoner at Blackfriars Crown Court in 2015. Serco is contracted by the Ministry of Justice to provide security services in court. We see them, but has pleaded guilty to failing to discharge general health and safety and the welfare duty that it's bound by. Humphrey Burke, who killed Miss Barwell, pleaded guilty to manslaughter by diminished responsibility and was given an indefinite hospital order. Rob, what do you make of this?
Well, on that particular case, in those circumstances, I think Serco should lose that particular contract. There's no question about that, in my mind. And they may want to take into consideration with other contracts, not related directly to that one, maybe, the performance of Serco. I mean, they are one of the government's biggest contractors. I think they're somewhere in the region of 250 million a year in terms. So they have a huge size in government in terms of their contractual base, and it's not easy to replace quickly that level of the size of those contracts. So there would need to be a period of adjustment if there was any question of them losing all their contracts, which I'm not suggesting they should, because there are many different parts to Serco. I think there are a number of different divisions that work individually from each other. So I would think on this case, yes, they should lose the contract, but overall I think, take it into consideration and see how they perform.
Well, the Health and Safety Inspectorate has said that Serco drastically failed in their duties to protect both Lorraine Barwell and other staff over a sustained period. It's not common to have a case covering such an extended period, but it appeared that Serco Limited were not learning from their mistakes. Lorraine Barwell and her colleagues were just doing their job and should have been protected from harm. Had Serco carried out their legal duties, these incidents could have been prevented. That is what the Health and Safety Inspectorate says. Luciana, what do you make of this?
This is a really horrific case.
Yep.
And we're talking about someone who's tragically lost their life. We're also having this conversation today when we learn that our prisons are weeks away from being completely full across the UK, and we desperately need people working in our prisons and working in the security services that support our criminal justice system. So I would agree with the point that's been made already that you can't just remove them totally,
yes.
But certainly they should be held to account. It's right that they have been held to account. And I say that because there's so many cases where you can't hold the companies to account. So I hope that it provides a small amount of solace, although it could never, ever replace someone who's tragically lost their life. But absolutely, in terms of how that company should now be appraised for any future contracts, this is incredibly serious. It's a shame that it's taken so long. I mean, this incident occurred 8 years ago, but absolutely, I would be very surprised if they were to gain big contracts in the result of as a result of this very, very horrific case.
Indeed, Alan.
Yeah, it's a terrible case, but I wouldn't jump too hastily to remove them on account of this case. I don't know the bigger picture with Serco. Funnily enough, I was reading today. I've commissioned the former executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, who's been working in the criminal justice system in America for the last 10 years, to write a piece about British prisons, and it's going to be not in the current prospect, but in the next prospect. And it was quite interesting just getting to the end of his piece. The one prison that he felt there was a ray of light was a private prison, for complex reasons, partly because they felt they were given more leeway than some of the publicly run prisons. So I'd hesitate to rush to remove companies like Serco from the system. But I would want to know more about whether this was a one-off or whether this was a pattern.
Indeed. Well, look, horrific case. And yes, I mean, it needs to be this kind of thing. We need to have mechanisms in place to ensure that we can try and prevent it happening again. More of your questions to come. You can put your question to our panel, calling 0345 6060 text 84850 and tweet at LBC, or by asking Alexa, who's a very dignified AI chatbot, always very astute, to send a comment to LBC. Saying what your question is. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC at 8:32, the news headlines with Tim Daly.
Ukraine says it was not involved in this morning's drone attack in Moscow, but was pleased by the strike. Russia says 8 were shot down, but several buildings were damaged and 2 people were injured. The Cabinet Office says the independent COVID inquiry doesn't have the power to demand personal WhatsApp messages and diaries. It's given the department 2 more days to hand over Boris Johnson's documents. And ITV executives are likely to face questions on what they knew about Philip Schofield's affair with a younger colleague when they meet a group of MPs. A source at the Department of Media, Culture and Sport Committee says a meeting to discuss a new law is being planned for next week. LBC weather, dry in many areas, but a chance of some drizzle tonight for the far north as well as central and eastern parts, a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC.
In a
Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:35. I'm joined by my panel this evening, Luciana Berger, the former Labour MP, Rob Wilson, former Conservative MP and Minister, Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect, and Adam Hawksbee from the think tank Onward. And Adam, you've got a report out today, which I've got here in front of me, Missing Millennials, Why the Conservatives Lost a Generation and How to Win Them Back. Tell me what it is, briefly.
So we wanted to understand why young people are moving away from the Conservative Party, and they really are. So 63% of millennials think the Tories deserve to lose the next election. The reason for that, they want housing, they want jobs, they want lower taxes, things they don't think the Tories are delivering. And although they like Rishi Sunak, he's got a 25 percentage point boost on the Conservative brand among people in their 30s, they don't feel they're seeing delivery at the moment.
OK. Well, Luciana, are you going to stand as a Labour MP next time?
No.
Oh, OK, that's news. I thought I'd ask you.
No, I've rejoined the party. I've rejoined the party, but I'm not a candidate.
Rob, are you standing?
I'm attracted to go back, but we'll see.
I love it. I love it. You know, you can take the man out of politics, but you can't take politics out of the man. Our next question is a text question from Rosalind in Malvern. And by the way, if you want to get your questions in, call 0345 6060 973, text on 84850, tweet at LBC, or ask Alexa to send a message to LBC with your question. So Rosalind in Malvern asks, almost 1 in 10 mortgage deals have been taken off the market in the last week alone. How can those who actually have a chance of getting onto the property ladder be helped to do so a bit more? Rob?
Well, the biggest challenge we face in the housing market, like everywhere else, is inflation. And we've got horrendous inflation. It's still up at 8.5%, I think. And the body responsible for inflation rate is the Bank of England.
Yes.
Now, the Bank of England has made some huge mistakes in recent years. Quantitative easing was a terrible mistake. To keep printing money at a time when actually they should have been restraining the money supply means that we now have inflationary pressures beyond the Ukraine war and the fuel problems that we have, and those they're not going away very quickly, and that's why interest rates are going up faster than they should, and that is what is putting pressure on everything else. And I think that it must be extraordinarily difficult for young people and young families with all the other inflationary pressures that are on them, to manage their mortgages at the moment. And the government has got to try and find a way to reduce some of to reduce inflation overall and reduce some of the costs that are flying in on families left, right and centre at the moment. It's not an easy problem to solve, but it's certainly something that the Bank of England must get a grip on. They're supposed to have this target of 2%, and they are certainly not hitting that and haven't hit it for a very long time, and they really haven't provided the reasons why they haven't. And if I were the government, I would be very angry with the way the governor of the Bank of England has run the bank over the last couple of years.
But Rob, look, you've got inflation still at 8.7%. A lot of it's being induced by the fact that there's a war on the eastern flank of Europe, so prices have gone up, energy costs have gone up. So that's part of the problem. Yes, you talk about QE, but there was also a little, shall we call it a sojourn, a 49-day little what can we describe it as? Whatever it was last year. I mean, we're paying the trust premium still on our mortgages, aren't we?
Well, this has happened today, this 1 in 10, and this happened at the time Liz Truss was in, and everybody blamed her for that. Now, what is the reason for this happening today? If what's the difference?
Well,
why is it happening today and also happened a year ago? I mean, the two things must have a common cause, and I believe that is around wider economic things rather than just the things that the Truss government particularly did at that time.
Adam?
I think the trust premium probably has gone by now, although that's because there's been a really unfortunate period of fiscal tightening. The government have had to spend less than they otherwise would to reassure the markets that they're reliable. But I think most analysts have said that at this point...
And huge intervention by the Bank of England.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a period that I would absolutely not want to repeat, where really bad decisions were made. But I think that premium has probably now gone. Yes, there's an access to finance issue. I think Rob is absolutely right. There is also a challenge with the price of housing because of the scarcity of it.
Yes.
I think that scarcity is for two reasons. One is we are just not building enough homes, that we need to build far more and have a system, both a planning system, a set of developers that are able to build much more quickly in places where there is demand. But it is also a scarcity of access to this good because too many homes are bought up by either domestic or foreign investors in order to be buy-to-let properties and aren't available to first-time buyers.
We had a whole discussion about that in the first hour, actually, about that very, very point. Luciana, what do you make of this?
Well, I don't agree that the Trust's legacy is over. It wasn't that many months ago, and certainly the impact was devastating and continues to impact around 800,000 families.
Well, I can tell you that I was speaking to a lot of investors at the time who were completely risk off the UK because their HQ, wherever they were, Canada or Australia, and big investors into the UK, just didn't want to invest here.
They didn't, and they still don't. And that's a particular challenge. I mean, I have the opportunity to meet with businesses every single day, and it's a real issue for us in the UK. And the fact that it happened and it was allowed to happen, and people don't forget. And as I said, there's 800,000 families at least in this country who are paying that premium on their mortgages today and are really, really struggling against also the increase in the cost of living that comes from inflation, food inflation that we just spoke about just a moment ago, energy inflation as well. There are so many things that can and should be done. This is not a new conversation in terms of how we equip and ensure that the next generation has the opportunity to be homeowners in the way that previous generations have enjoyed. Certainly, I don't even know where to begin. There's so many different things that could be introduced and haven't. The fact that the government has taken away the targets for house building or relaxed them is one travesty, because it means that all local areas now don't have an incentive or kind of that focus that they did have before. We've got some of the lowest levels of house building this country has ever seen. So if we're not building the houses in the first place, it means there's obviously a much less pool of supply, and it means the prices are higher. And we know that that's a challenge. The issue around the foreign buy-to-lets and the foreign ownership in this country is a challenge, but it's a challenge in particular areas of this country. It's not
particularly London,
particularly the capital and the southeast, but it's not an issue that impacts across the country. And it's still, I was previously a member of Parliament in the northwest of England, and that is not an area that's being hit by foreign investment in the same way. But certainly there's a massive challenge to equip and to ensure that the next generation has the opportunity. They can't afford it, and certainly as you would expect, but I welcome the proposals that Labour are talking about ensuring that there's a government-backed scheme to help those first-time buyers, to get them onto the ladder, to provide them with some assurances, and to back their that opportunity at that first stage. It's slipping out of reach for so many people. The average age of house ownership in this country is only going up, not going down.
It is, and it's becoming a serious wedge issue, I think, for the election as well, and more people living at home. Alan, this question from Rosalind is about new mortgage deals being taken off the market, so it's very difficult for people to get on the housing ladder. That's one issue, but there's also a big refinancing cliff coming potentially this year with people who have managed to get onto the housing ladder. So there's two issues. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is about the only thing that Liz Truss will be remembered for in her brief tenure. I mean, I quite liked the idea of 100% mortgages that were being floated last week by the Skipton Building Society to people who had proven that they had track record and being able to repay rental for over a period. But I think this ties in with your question to Adam about his report on the millennials and housing being such a strong issue. And I'm really interested in the quite bold moves that Starmer is making on this. It's been a long time before bold and Starmer have been used in the same sentence.
He's doing more and more bold.
Yeah, I think he is, and I think he's right to. And I think only by boldness, the sort of boldness that we saw with Labour in the 60s and 70s when they were building entire new towns, or the Tories in the 80s and 90s with the urban regeneration things that they did. Heseltine is synonymous with that. Only by that kind of political boldness are we really going to cope.
Alan, just going to let me ask you one thing. As you mentioned 100% mortgages, 100% loan-to-value mortgages. Isn't that what got us into the mess with subprime in the US in the first place? Don't we have to be very, very careful?
Very, very careful, which is, I mean, listening to the Skipton people I heard on the radio, if it's true that they're only lending it to people who have got the proven track record of sometimes paying more in rental than they would be paying in mortgage repayments, then I think that's something worth considering.
Well, fantastic discussion around that particular topic. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. Joined by this fantastic panel here. Get your questions in if you've still got any on 03456060973. Text me on 84850 and tweet at LBC. Listen to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:45.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:48. I'm Ali Miraj, and I'm joined by Luciana Berger, the Labour MP, Rob Wilson, the former Conservative MP, Alan Rusbridger, the editor of Prospect, and Adam Hawksbee from the Onward think tank. And the next question is from Martin in Doncaster. Good evening, Martin.
Hello, Ali and panel. Yeah, my question is net migration is too high, according to the PM himself, and the 40 new hospitals have been delayed. Why should a Tory manifesto pledge be trusted?
Adam.
I think there is a real problem here that the Conservatives have, where they've consistently made pledges on immigration and not delivered them, by the PM's own admission. I do think net migration is too high. I think it has been inflated by the fact we've got the Ukraine scheme, the Hong Kong scheme, but nonetheless it is higher than it needs to be. And we need to look at things like how we fund our universities, which currently are too reliant on foreign students, and our reliance on low-wage foreign labour. So I do think we need to bring those figures down, and we need to close the gap between rhetoric and delivery, because it's corrosive to politics when you pledge one thing and another thing occurs.
Luciana, what do you make of this?
I think it's a point well made that there's a government marking his own homework and saying it's a problem when he and his party have been responsible for this country for the last 13 years. And I do think it's a massive problem when you make a commitment to build hospitals, which this country desperately needs. We've got 7 million people waiting on waiting lists across the country, and then not to deliver them. That's two examples of pledges that have been made. I do think it's a problem for our politics. I think if you make that commitment and having not there's a difference between been lots of detail that you find in the manifesto and kind of headline commitments. The government has broken its headline commitments, and I think that betrays our democracy, and I think that erodes the confidence that the public has in our politics. And I think all parties have a responsibility, even more so now than ever before, to only be making pledges and promises that they know they can keep, and that certainly hasn't been the case to date.
Does it matter, Luciana, that the government, Steve Barclay, who said that when he was pressed about the 40 hospitals, whether it was 35 or 40 or whatever it was, there is a lot more capital going into new hospitals. So does it matter if you, as a patient, have a better experience in a brand spanking new shiny hospital with decent equipment? Does it really matter if it's a wing or if it's a new building?
I mean, we can argue the merits of whether we should have new hospitals or whether we should treat more people in the community or how we should configure our health services. The challenge is that the government made a promise. They made a pledge and said they were going to build these. I remember when the press release came out, it was 30, 35, 40 hospitals. Say it's 30, let's go with the lower figure. That hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. And now we have a situation, a very, very severe situation within our NHS. We're not even in a winter crisis, and we have millions of people waiting for operations around our country. And so therefore, it's even more pronounced that the government hasn't delivered. So it's not just about bricks and mortar, but if you're going to go as far and say you're going to build these things, then you should deliver on that, and they haven't.
Rob, it's your party, the Tory party. Can it be trusted?
Yes, of course it can be trusted. It's just that obviously politics changes from day to day and month to month, and different pressures rise and fall as part of that. And at the moment, Rishi Sunak and government ministers would agree. Net migration is far too high, and student numbers obviously inflate that, and they're trying to take some action, for example, by not allowing partners and family members to come. Obviously, Ukraine and Hong Kong have inflated that as well. There also is illegal migration and legal migration, and I think that every time the Conservative Party tries to deal with the illegal routes and some of the big issues to do with the slave trade and so forth, the Labour Party opposes it. In particular, they've opposed the Rwanda policy, which could have made a difference to deterring people from coming through the legal route and risking their lives coming across the channel.
But Rob, why make a pledge back? You remember David Cameron making that pledge about the tens of thousands. Why bother leading people up the hill to only march them down again?
Well, I think that governments believe that they have more power to do things and they can pull levers and things happen. And what we've certainly found over the past 15, 20 years, it's not just under Conservative governments, is that actually governments have a lot less power to make change than they actually think. I mean, I can remember back when the Labour Party was in power, there were a number of promises they made about schools and hospitals and things, and they didn't deliver on the promises they made. But it just happens because governments believe that their own hype, as it were, that they can do things, and then they get in and they see what the reality of power actually is.
Wow, what a damning indictment of power. Luciana, what do you think about this point about Labour's blocking any plans to tackle the asylum issue, people crossing small boats in the Channel, putting their lives at risk?
I think Labour's been pretty clear to set out some very practical things that can be done to tackle illegal immigration into this country. And they certainly put forward measures when this has been discussed in Parliament. There's been, it's about, I think, first and foremost, how we tackle the illegal immigration, and there are things that can and should be done and haven't been done so far. It's about tackling first and foremost the illegal, the smuggling groups.
Well, that I think is absolutely bang on a fair point, Alan.
Well, one of the satisfactions of editing a monthly magazine is you can escape the headlines. And I recently asked the former Home Office Permanent Secretary David Normington to write about immigration. And he wrote 4,000 words of really good common sense, which began, forget the small boats. All the headlines are about the small boats, but that is a tiny problem, insignificant numbers. This is where you should be looking. And I just think it's overdue that we have a proper, sensible, informed debate about this that gets away from promises that can't be delivered, from this concentration on small boats and to sensible policy.
Very briefly, Luciana, because I want to get another question.
It's just a small point, just to say that what would make a massive difference is if the cases were processed.
Exactly.
95% of people that came to this country last year, their immigration cases have not been processed, and that doesn't help anyone.
Too many people waiting for far too long. There's a text question coming from Connie in Reading, which is very topical, because it says, what does your panel consider to be more important, Kathleen Stock's freedom to speak at the Oxford Union or a protester's right to glue themselves to the floor? There were demonstrations, just for background here, there were demonstrations outside the Oxford Union this evening prior to the appearance of the gender-critical academic Kathleen Stock at a debate within the building. And then during the debate, she was heckled repeatedly whilst one protester glued themselves to the floor. I shouldn't laugh. That person was arrested, but has since been de-arrested again. I don't know what to make of that. Rob?
Well, I have always regarded freedom of speech to be the number one priority. So, and if somebody wanted to glue themselves to the floor, that's fine, as long as they let the other person speak while they're glued there, and they can stay there as long as they want glued to the floor, in my view. I think people are trying to shout Kathleen Stock down, and I don't think that is the right thing to do. She has a legitimate and valid point of view that should be heard, and it is a view that is expressing what I regard as a mainstream view, which is trying to put the case for women. And, you know, women in terms of, you know, the trans debate is, should, you know, men be allowed should women... men be allowed in women's sport, should they be allowed in women's prisons? And I think that she has an absolute point that she needs to make, and it's right for her to make, and that's why she should be heard and she should be listened to. I'm not saying everybody should agree with her. You know, there will be differences of views. But because people have hurt feelings, that's not a good enough reason not to hear the view.
Understood. Alan, you've got a lot of experience of supporting people who speak out, notably Edward Snowden. What do you make of this?
Well, I think we have to speak up for the right of the gluers and the speakers. It's all part of the same picture. Of course, Kathleen Stock should be allowed to speak. I've published her in Prospect, and you know, the only way you can defeat argument is with better arguments. But I think we also had to defend the right of people to glue themselves or climb gantries or disturb things in the cause of climate protest. And I'm dismayed that many people are selective in wanting to support one kind of speech, but not the other kind of speech.
Luciana?
We have a law in this country, and it guarantees freedom of expression. And universities have a duty to protect that freedom of expression. Yep. That applies equally, I think, to anyone who wants to express that expression in words, and it also protects people that want to protest as well. So I don't think it's an either or in this case. I think.
Adam, do you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely think that both parties should have the ability to speak, and I worry that this particular debate about women-only spaces is becoming this kind of broader culture war type. And actually, there are some extremely specific issues around the provision of healthcare, around prisons, around sport that need to be dealt with calm heads. And so I hope that we can have the conversation, better arguments beat other arguments, so on and so forth, and we get to a better place.
Well, I think calm heads prevail. Now, very quickly, the fun question at the end, which we always keep, which always instills fear into the panel. Tom and Harrogate asks, rock band Royal Blood had a tantrum at a music festival at the weekend, moaning that the crowd wasn't very enthusiastic about their performance before eventually storming off stage. Be honest, have you ever had cause to have a public tantrum, even if it wasn't in front of thousands of people? Alan?
Well, one of my favourite sayings about editors was by George Bernard Shaw, who said that lighthouse keepers with radios know more about the world than editors. And there's a very true statement, because editors are really boring people. They never go out. And no, I've never had a public meltdown, but that's because I'm a very, very boring person.
Luciana?
I came close. I was a member of the Health and Social Care Select Committee.
Yes, I remember
and what's
that.
prompted me to think about this was our earlier serious conversation about prisons. The Select Committee was doing an inquiry into prison health, and it was my job I had a question of the Minister, and my first question to her, and I won't embarrass her on this channel, but I asked her if she'd ever visited a prison health service. And she hadn't, and I nearly had a meltdown.
Well, understandably. Adam?
My karaoke song is That's Life by Frank Sinatra.
Oh.
And I once went along to a karaoke evening, put in my request in my slip and sat there for a good couple of hours until someone else sang it. And I hate to say, I sort of slammed the book closed, drank my drink and then left.
It's a shame we don't have more time. I'd get you to do it here. Rob?
Well, I don't remember a public one that. What I did do once was on Twitter. I actually a constituent wrote into me on Twitter, and I replied to them to not be a sore loser. Because it was on election night, and I just won the.
That's like Theresa Mail and Theresa Mail.
You could have said a lot worse. Fascinating. Look, brilliant, really a great panel. Thanks so much for all your time and all your questions as well to our listeners out there. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And by the way, Lil Wayne, the American rapper, also stormed off on stage the other day because his crowd was not reacting the way he wanted. So this seems to be a trend. Who knows? Thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was a great edition of Cross Question, and credit to Corey for putting together such a stellar panel yet again. He always knocks us out of the park. So, what am I going to be talking about next? Well, I think it's going to be Nicola Sturgeon, who has actually said that she is thinking long and hard about becoming a foster parent. She said, the former First Minister this is, that there was a burning need for change in the system that deals with children in care, and that she felt a duty to ensure that it happens. Despite her move to the backbenches at Holyrood, she's actually said that she's spent a lot of time talking to youngsters and was very well supported by dedicated members of staff in children's homes and exceptional foster carers. And she's talking about the importance of foster care and what it means to her, and the fact that she might actually consider doing it. So what are your experiences of being a foster parent or a foster child? Call me on 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, there are conflicting reports about who was behind drone strikes in Moscow. The Ukrainian government has rejected